Good evening, everyone. My name's Anne, and I work at the Parenting Research Centre and raisingchildren.net.au, and I'm joined by Elly Robinson, who is our presenter tonight. And we've also got Kim, who's looking after some of the tech aspects off camera tonight, who some of you have been chatting with in our chat room. Welcome to our Parenting Now webinar on parenting preteens positively. For those of you who haven't done a webinar before, a webinar is a bit like an interactive talk that happens over the internet. So you'll be watching this live unless you are watching a recording that you'll get later. But for us, it's live. So we'll be interacting with you through the chat room and talking to you for the next hour live. If you're joining us from a computer, like a laptop or a desktop computer, you'll be getting the most out of the session tonight. There may be some limitations if you're joining us from a mobile device, but you should still be able to hear us and get the information tonight. So let's spend a minute just looking over what you see in front of you. You should be able to hear us through your speakers or your headphones and see us in a video now on your screen. Throughout the session, we will turn the video off, which will help to stabilise the connection for some of you. And we may turn it on again as we go, and we'll have it on at the end when we have some questions. Also, you'll be able to see some slides, I think to the left of the video, which Elly will be talking to as we go on. Something else to note is that you can hear us, but your microphone is muted. So the way that you interact with us during the webinar is through the chat box, which you'll be able to see in the bottom left of your screen. And you can type into the box and the message or the comment or the question will pop up above for everyone who's participating in the webinar to see. And we really want you to use this chat box because that chat box is what makes this interactive, and that's how we can communicate with you and get you instant feedback and answer your questions, as many as we can as we go. You can also use the chat box to talk to each other. My job tonight is just to feed your questions to Elly, who's our expert, and some during the presentation and some after. And I'll just apologise if we don't get to all of your questions. If you're having any problems with the technology, just post your question there, and Kim in the tech section will get onto that and respond to you. If for some reason that's not working, there's a help desk in Sydney, and the number is 1800 733 416, and I think that closes at 8:30, but the chat box will be open. And we remember that we will be sending you a recording of this webinar, so if you have to leave, if your teenager or your preteen needs you while you're here, you can click on the link that we send you and you'll get all of the information, and you can watch that in your own time. The webinar will go for about 40 minutes and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end to ask some of your questions to Elly. I think I need to have some acknowledgements just before we get started with the body of the presentation. I'd first really like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of East Melbourne, where Elly and Kim and I are coming to you from tonight. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where you are on, because we're all over Australia. We've had some Sydney people in the chat box tonight. Anywhere that you are in Australia or even around the world, we'd like to pay our respects to elders, past and present, and also to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are watching tonight or watching the recording. We'd also like to acknowledge the Victorian Government. Parenting Now webinars are developed by the Parenting Research Centre in collaboration with Australian experts and brought to you by raisingchildren.net.au, which is the website that you may have found this webinar link from. They're funded by the Victorian Department of Education and Training, and it's generous support, and that's the reason that we're able to bring you these webinars for free tonight. Some other things to note before I hand over to Elly is that parenting can be stressful and life can be stressful, and we'd just like to call your attention to some help that is available should you need it. Raising Children Network has links to some helplines, parenting helplines and hotlines. parent line in your state. The number is different for each state, so that will be available through direct delivery assistance or online in your state, and of course Lifeline. I also need to point out that we really welcome your questions, and please keep them coming, whatever comes to mind. But tonight we're going to be offering general advice. We're not going to be offering sort of one-on-one specific advice, but don't hold back with your questions. We'll try and get some answers to you one way or another. And finally, be good to each other in chat, because some of this, the things that come up might be personal. Everyone's got different opinions on parenting, and I think it's a sharing forum, and I think we all know how to behave in that forum. This webinar is suitable for parents and carers of children aged 9 to 12 years who are looking for information around parenting their children as they become teenagers. So this is the first of 2 webinars aimed at parents of preteens. The next webinar is on Tuesday night, next Tuesday, and that one will be focusing in a little bit more detail on preteens and technology. So the sorts of things would be Instagram and internet use. If you haven't signed up for that one, we'd love you to. It's also free. You'll get a link to sign up to that webinar in the future emails that we send you after this webinar. So that will be a reminder to you when you get those emails that you can sign up. And of course, here's Elly, who you've been waiting to hear. Elly is a senior specialist at the Parenting Research Centre. She has extensive experience in adolescent health and welfare as a practitioner for helping parents, and as a researcher, so she's across the evidence, so a bit of both, which is fantastic. And she's also worked in workforce development. Her work centres on helping practitioners use evidence in practice, particularly in areas of mental health and child welfare. She has many strings to her bow. She's also co-author of 3 books on parenting. The most recent of her books you may have seen, it's called Surviving Adolescence 2. So you really do have an expert here tonight. And if that wasn't enough, she's the mum of a teenager. So you are in extremely good hands. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what she's got to say, because I'm also the mum of a teenager. And I will pass you over to Elly.
Thanks so much, Anne, and welcome to everybody tonight. It's great to see so many people here and engaging in a topic which is very close to my heart in building the skills of parents to enter those teenage years in a positive and constructive way. So thanks very much for coming tonight. As Anne mentioned, the focus is on preteens tonight, so around about the 9 to 12-year-old age group. And again, it's important to focus on this age group because they get much less attention than the early years. That's where a lot of the research happens and parenting advice occurs. And then you jump into the adolescent or teenage years as well. But really there's some unique things that happen in the 9 to 12-year-old age group that it's great to have parents aware of and understanding as they move into those teenage years. Not so much a quiet period. I think we can thank Sigmund Freud for that when he talked about this being the latent period. But we know now through research that Sigmund didn't quite get it right. There's actually quite a bit going on at this age developmentally. So it's not the quiet period that we once thought it was. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we move through. But it's a real window of opportunity for parents to establish good habits and prepare for those teenage years. So just a quick poll to get going, just to get an idea about the spread of ages of children of people here tonight. So just clicking the little circle next to the coloured box. Okay, so some people are preparing very early with 8 or younger, that's good to see, but mostly around that preteen ages, so 10, 11, a little bit of 12. We've got some non-parents attending as well, so that's great. You can be a source of information for many people around you. Let's give it another... Okay, we've stopped now. Yep, so we've got a few with 10 or 11, a little bit younger, reasonable spread of ages. So, yep, that's good to know that there's lots in this age group to learn. Okay. So we talk about the 5 worlds of adolescence. Once upon a time, this was only 4 worlds. We talked about the domains that impact on a teenager's life as being school, individual factors, peer factors, and family. But of course, we now know that in the last few years that technology has played a huge role in the way that teenagers develop. Very different world from what we grew up with in ourselves. So a little bit different from teaching children to ride a bike that we know how to do. So teaching them how to use technology is not something we experienced at their age. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these worlds and why they're important in the preteen years, and what we can do to understand those worlds a bit better and support them through making them a protective space. So just to start with school, and of course what happens at this age is that you have an upcoming or are in the midst of that school transition. And what really happens here is you find that the child it makes that transition from what is a fairly small and care-oriented environment, often a smaller environment. They have one main teacher, they're the top of the rung of the ages of kids, and suddenly this big switch to a much larger, more impersonal school environment with multiple teachers, and it's quite a quick transition. And this really happens at a time when young people need the connection with adults and supportive adults around them. So we thrust them into these environments which suddenly change that support right at the time where they need the most support from adults. So a good lesson for us as parents to make sure that we keep building those connections to other adults around them. So that might be through sport and through other activities, which we'll talk about a bit later. And it also, it's a shift for parents as well, because often in the teen years you're very much involved in the school environment, and it's quite a dramatic shift to move to this, the senior school years when the emphasis is on the child to be independent and to take responsibility for knowing where they need to go, what they need to do. So parents often find this quite abrupt. So it's good to know what's coming and familiarise yourself with what happens in terms of that transition. And of course this comes at the same time as children want to increasingly be independent from families, spend more time with peers, and I'll talk about each of those as we go. So just another poll around how your child gets to school, and this is getting a bit at those changes around how they get there in terms of independence, that building excitement about being able to get there by themselves or with friends. So just having a look. Yeah, so lots of children at this age walking or riding with parents or driving with parents or others, a few on public transport. And that's probably indicative of the ages we have here as well. And there'll be that growing where children that they might start to request to be able to walk by themselves or walk with friends to school or catch the bus. And often coming into the secondary school years, that's a requirement as well, that the school is a little farther away. So often it's good to build that confidence and ability to be more independent about getting to school. So we'll stop that poll there. Thanks, Anne. So moving into the next world we'll have a look at is around what's happening for the young person as an individual. And of course, again, we've got this big change that happens around this time. Puberty, we know, starts earlier than it had in pre-industrial years, 200 years or so ago, where the first age of first menstruation for young women was around the age of 16. That's now dropped to 13. And a lot of that is related to better health environments, good diet, and those sorts of things. So that started to plateau a bit. It's hovering still around 13. But also what we know from research is that early stages of puberty actually happen a lot earlier, but they're less visible to people. So things like the changes in sex hormones, not the characteristics that you'll see physically, like breast budding or changes in pubic hair, but internal changes are happening at around 8 to 9 years. So some of you might notice with children around that age that things start to change there. There's more emotional, they have a more emotional world. Things like body odour starts to change. So you'll find that carrying a group of boys from the soccer club when they're 8 smells a whole lot different from carrying them when they were much younger. So these changes start to happen a little bit earlier than we were aware of before. And very much an acute awareness of their changing bodies. So big question at this age and in early adolescence is, am I normal? And you'll find that they're asking these questions because they see them and their peers changing around them and what goes on for their bodies. Really important at this stage to be aware of that sensitivity around their bodies and try and avoid teasing or talking about body image as they're going through this growing phase.
Elly, we had quite a few questions from people in the registration questions around mood swings. Is this something to do with hormones and puberty as well?
Yeah, definitely, and it's a good point to bring up because I'll talk a little bit more in a sec around the fact that we often think of the teenage years as being very much around storm and stress and those changes in hormones and the changes in the way that they behave. And much of that behaviour is completely normal for this age group. So really good to get a sense and read up. And of course, you being here tonight will help as well to get that developmental perspective on what's going on for your child. And that mood swings are a common issue. Often they don't last long. Of course, you never know when they wake in the morning once they get into the teenage years about whether you're going to be hugged or whether they're going to walk straight past you. Very common. And, you know, that will change quite regularly. So, yeah, very common at this age. Important to point out though, and it's a good time to bring it up, because what we don't want is to really get caught up in that idea that the teenage years are storm and stress. You often hear about this idea that, yep, mood swings are just so common at this age. It's just part of being a teenager. And the reason why it's important to keep an eye on this is because what we want to understand is what is that normal development and what is something that might need a little bit more attention around a young person's welfare. So if we just assume that any of that behaviour is related to being a teenager, we might miss those signs that need greater support. And I'll just run you through a few things. This slide is around understanding when that behaviour might be more than normal teenage behaviour, when it might be time to worry and to maybe talk to your GP about what's going on. We know that in the teenage years that mental health problems become more common. So getting onto them early is a really useful and really important thing to do. So again, this is consistent behaviour over time rather than that shifting mood over a day or a few hours. If a child or a young teenager is withdrawing from their friends, if there's a sustained or continued decline in their school performance over time, so their grades start to drop quite dramatically and keep dropping. This depressed mood over 2 or 3 weeks. So again, quite common for a child or a young teenager to be a bit teary at times or to be moody or to be aggressive is quite normal behaviour at this age. But that consistent depressed mood for 2 or 3 weeks is a sign that there might be something that needs a bit more checking out. And if they're no longer enjoying or engaging in the things that they love, so it might be that they played a lot of a particular sport or they like to do a particular things with their friends. Again, that change in doing different things is quite normal. They'll start to engage in different activities. But if they're no longer enjoying anything, important to get some help, and the best person to go to in the first instance is your GP. Also great information on places like raisingchildren.net.au. Okay, moving on to the next world, which is around peers. And some of you will notice if you have got to the late primary school years, particularly in grade 6 or the equivalent in different states, that the peer relationships start to get a little bit wobbly later in that late primary phase. And again, it goes back to the changes that are happening aren't at the same pace as each other. So it's where you might get physical changes that make one child in grade 6 much more physically stronger and bigger than another child who developmentally is less aligned with that. So suddenly the way that both cognitive and physical changes are happening, you've got a group of children who aren't quite in sync with each other. So it starts to affect friendships. There's often a difference in the way that their peer groups will align. So it might be that they move from very much hanging out with same-sex friends to wanting to hang out in mixed gender groups, or that they've hung out with the opposite gender for some time and they start to change to be more engaged in and have more friends in at the same sex as they are. Often that changes around this time. And going back to those different developmental timetables, it's also a time where bullying is very common and might come up for the first time. So again, checking in with your child around some of those signs that things like a depressed mood or withdrawal from friends might be a sign of bullying. So I'll talk a little bit about having those conversations with children and early teens in a minute. Most common type of bullying is name calling. Moving along to family, and what we know and what's very common that people talk about at this age is how important friends become, and they certainly do. Your child will want to spend more time with their friends, and they'll start to change that. They do want to spend less time with family. Important to still maintain those family connections, and a really important message that I want you to take from this is that peers don't replace parents. Both sets of people in that young person's life play a different role. So while they continue to and increasingly engage with their peers, they're getting their support and understanding around their own cultural settings and the way that they interact with each other socially. But parents still remain as the main source of support and advice and the place where they can come home to for support when they go out there and they test out their identity. They come home and they are with parents and family that understand them. Often this will manifest in the classic one that parents often feel happens more at this age is you get that real pushback that it's about, I hate you, I don't want anything to, slamming doors, really pushing back on parents. Partly that's because you're the safe person for them. When they go out and test out and be a different person and try out different identities in the outside world, you're that safe person to come home to that they can let go of that energy. Really hard to handle, but having that developmental perspective on why that happens, certainly not tolerating violent or abusive behaviour, but understanding that in that developmental perspective, and when that dies down, having that conversation with the child around, you know, you really were a bit out of control there, or you really need to find other ways to interact. What also happens is, as part of this, is they start to open their eyes to the fact that parents are just mere mortals. So rather than being the magical creatures they were of the childhood years, that the terrible flaws of parents suddenly come to light. So that increasing realisation that parents are just other people who have the same emotions and the same feelings and the same hopes and dreams as they do. So this shift in relationship with parents as they start to realise this. They start to crave that independence, again, hanging out with friends, being very sensitive to adult control. So again, if you're trying to crack down on what the young person is doing, trying to take control of that situation and be authoritative around that, you'll find that pushback happens and you'll get more conflict and more arguments will happen. And again, I'll go into some communication skills that will help with that. Again, I can't express enough that there's that need for family to be there when it gets overwhelming. It does become a different relationship, but having that routine in the background, being able to come home to the meal on the table at the same time at night, knowing that your parent is going to be sitting in bed reading a book at 9 o'clock at night, incredibly important things for that young person to have that consistency while they go through this stage. Okay, a little bit about communication. So the reason why I bring this up here, which is around communicating with teenagers, but if you start to build in these ways of communicating in this preteen age range, and you can continue them into the teen years, then it's really helpful to practice these skills and get to know how to use them as you move into those teen years. So first one is about disconnecting. If you want to have that conversation with your child, both of you need to unplug from the I this and the I that, put away the technology, make eye contact with the young person and engage in that conversation and listen to what they're saying. Location is a big one as well. So what starts to happen at this age group is that it's what psychologists call situational cues. So when the parent comes and stands in the doorway of the bedroom and lets out a huge sigh, what that says to the child is they're about to get the big lecture. So they're already tuned to the fact that that's what's about to happen. So what's a good idea is if you want to have a deep conversation or a good conversation with your child, that you find somewhere outside the house to do it. Great places to go, cafes, parks. The classic one that gets talked about at this age group is taking them for a drive somewhere. And the reason why this is so good is that they don't need to make eye contact with you. They can talk when they feel comfortable, and they're basically captive in the car. So you can go drive down the highway and have the conversation that you need to have appropriately still. If they're not engaged in the conversation, then leave it be for another time. But cars are really good places to be able to have good conversations with your child. When you're both in the mood, and again, I can't stress this enough, this is not just that your child is receptive to a conversation, but also that you're in the right frame of mind to be able to have that conversation. And it's perfectly all right if you start to feel like the anger is rising, or you feel like you're about to yell at your child, and we've all been there, that you realise that and you're able to say, I don't want to talk about this right now. I'm not feeling in the right frame of mind. Perhaps just let me calm down for a little while. I'm going to go for a walk around the block and I'll come back and we'll make another time to talk. So not only are you demonstrating that appropriate management of your emotions and demonstrating and role modelling that to your child, but you're also giving yourself a break and being in the right frame of mind to have that conversation. Clarity, so don't have long monologues around what you want your child to understand. They've got a very short attention span, so get to the point of what you want to say, repeat the point and make sure that they can repeat that back to you as well about what you want them to do. Use very concrete images with them as well, so much easier to communicate. If they're going to the shop, you'll often find that kids will get confused about exactly what it is that you want. So be quite clear about, if you're going to the shop, this is the type of milk to get. Show them what it is in the fridge. This is the type of whatever to get, so that they've got a very concrete idea of what you need. Culture, really important to understand what it's like to be a teenager these days. So jump online and play Fortnite with them. Get to know what the game's about. Understand what they want to watch on telly and go and watch a few episodes of it so you understand what it is. Understand what music they're listening to and listen to that as well. Understand as much as you can about the world that your young person is living in. And this is the number one piece of advice I was given when I became a teenager or a parent, is choose your battles. So save your energy for the things that really matter. And often they're about things like safety, making sure that the child is safe, making sure that they're respectful to the people around them. As my co-author will say, no one ever died of an untidy bedroom. Shut the door and walk away. So choose your battles around what you expend your energy on. We'll talk a little bit about rituals and traditions, because what I want to impart here is that the rituals that you had when your child was young, you can still have them coming into the teenage years, still really important. So things that grow with your child. So it might be that when they were younger, you had the bedtime ritual of having a bath, reading a book, going to sleep. When they are a little bit older, you might want to make that something where when the child starts secondary school, they get to stay up later on the weekend and you watch a film together. So maintaining something that just lifts what's happening above the ordinary and makes it into something that has a bit of fanfare about it. Again, things like having Friday night pizza, going to the footy or to some sort of sports match on a Saturday. Those things that, again, are predictable for that young person as they move through this quite chaotic phase of development. So yeah, it's never too late. Teenagers still need to really feel as though the family will be there for them and have their back over these years. So they might complain about rituals that are still in place, but they'll also be the first to complain if they're cancelled. So yeah, put these rituals in place, make sure that they continue through the teen years. What we know from research is that family rituals lead to fewer risk behaviours, better social connection, and more secure relationships in adulthood. So that's an evidence-based strategy.
I'm just going to interject a little bit, because we had a lovely question from Catherine in the registration questions, and I think that you've just answered it, and I'll just point out that you've answered it. The question was, how do you maintain connection despite difficulties? And we had a lot of questions about communication, and this one was about connection, and I guess it's a little bit different, and I think that's what you're talking about now, right?
Yeah, it is a bit different. I think maintaining a one-on-one relationship with your child through that time as well. So it might, even if it's only 10 minutes a day, just making that time where that child is the absolute centre of your attention, and starting that from these years in the preteen years, but continuing it on into teenage years. And being, again, going back to that understanding things like teen culture and what they're watching and what they're doing, having things to talk about with them, about the characters in the show, about the books they're reading, things that are connection points for you and your child. Again, it's great for a child to be in a position where they can become the expert of something. So I'll talk a bit more about this next week, but a great thing to do is if your child is really invested in an online game or social media, they can teach you how to play it or how to use that social media. They get to be the expert for once. Just a really nice way to build that relationship together.
So you're sort of looking to them for a bit of guidance on that connection. It doesn't have to come from you. You can let them take the lead, and that's how you build the connection as well.
Yeah, that's right. And persist with that. It might be that you make an effort to do that at some stage and it doesn't quite come off, but try again at some stage when the connection is there and you're having a good time, that you open up those conversations and understand your child and their world. Yep.
Great advice.
Yeah. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about technology, although I'll talk much more about this next week. So just to reiterate, there's a tech use webinar next week. I'll be doing that again, and that's again around how to set up good technology boundaries and rules in your house and about technology use at that age. So you'll receive a link in the email about tonight's webinar and when we send a link to the recording. But I'll just talk briefly about tech use at this age. What we see is that once the child moves into the preteen and early adolescent years, that the use of technology becomes more social. So particularly around the use of social media. So I'm sure some of you are in those battles about whether the child should have access to social media accounts. Classic ones at this age are Instagram, Snapchat, those sorts of things. The important thing is that you make those decisions. So when they come home and say, well, John and Juliet both get to use Instagram and their parents have let them have an account for the last year, what you can say is, that's great, thanks for letting me know how other parents deal with this. In my household, we give you access at this time. So again, great to know what other parents are doing, but you make the decisions around when that's the right choice for your child. It's very different these days. Technology is available 24/7. So when we were growing up, the friendship stopped when the school gate closed at the end of the day. You might, if you were in my sort of generation, you might be lucky enough to wrestle the phone off your older sisters and hide for a while to be able to talk to someone. We certainly didn't have mobile phones there, but very different world now. So it's a 24/7 world. So make sure you put in place those boundaries and limits as you would with any behaviour. I think there's times where anecdotally I've heard parents say, I just don't know how to set boundaries around technology. And my answer is the same as you would set boundaries around anything else. You can say no to technology use. You can turn off the Wi-Fi at night. There's a set prescribed time in your household when things get turned off. And the important thing is putting these in place now, because trying to retrospectively apply rules once the horse has bolted is terribly hard. So get used to what you want to do now, start to impose those rules and put them in place before the teenage years start. But I do also want to say that tech gets a really bad rap, and it's not all bad. It's a very creative space for young people to be. It's a global space for them to be, and particularly for young people who have a reason why they might need a connection on an online world rather than an offline world. So that might be around social anxiety, excuse me, or a chronic illness that they have where they're trying to connect with someone else who might be on the other side of the world who's experiencing the same things as they can. Yep.
So I might remind people that next week, in case you missed a bit at the start where I mentioned this, we actually do have a devoted webinar on preteens and tech. And I've had another look at some of your questions that you've been asking, and I think a lot of those we'll hang on to them, and we'll ask Elly those questions next week. And I think they'll be very relevant when you address technology next week. And I think it's a hot button topic at the moment, especially with this age group.
Definitely, yep. I'm just noting on the comments that someone's saying she shuts off, she puts her headphones on and says she wants alone time. That's fine. I mean, I think if the young person, often they need that downtime, and the classic thing that you get at the end of the school day is you say, "How was your day, honey?" And they say, "Good." You know, what happened? Not much. They really need that downtime. School is a very involved and really busy environment. So if they do shut down and they put on their headphones, you know, wait for that moment where they come out of that and have that conversation if you need to.
And I guess they at that age may not even know that they need that downtime. They may, you know, just think that they want to listen to music. They don't know that there's that emotional need to just shut off.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. So you've got to be your child's mind for a while there. You're the one that's interpreting the behaviour. So they might not see it as something where they're shutting down. It's a very good point. They just see it as something that they need to do at that point in time, very concrete thinking about what they need. So again, you know, and you might want to talk to them later about saying, hey, when you come home, you shut down, you put your headphones on, you know, what can we do? Or make a time to talk to them later, or organise something on the weekend that you can take them out and, do that. Okay, I know there's a couple more questions coming through around those sorts of things. I'll just answer the one around how old is too young for a phone. Very common question at this age, and again, often it's at the later primary school years or moving into secondary school where it becomes a practical decision when you need to be able to know where your child is when they start to have that independence. Now, the trick is whether they get a smartphone or not is a different thing. And again, that's up to you as a parent to make that judgment about whether they have demonstrated that they have the responsibility, that they have the respect and the way that they interact with people, that when they do get a phone, that with that right to have a phone comes the responsibility to use it in a way that is respectful of other people, and you set the rules around that before they so much as lay their hands on that phone. So I'll talk again about that a little bit more next week. Just wanted to give you an example of how it's not so bad. So this was a friend of mine whose son Charlie was starting at a different high school to many of his friends, and he was quite a naturally anxious young man, and he was very worried that he would have trouble making new friends at this school. At the Year 7 orientation day, he met some boys who were in his new class, and they exchanged phone numbers, which meant that over the summer holidays they were able to get in touch and catch up and play some online games. What that meant that was when Charlie started school, he'd already met some of the kids, and he was actually really excited about getting there and being able to see his friends again. So just an example of how it can be used positively and give children something that is positive in the way that they use it. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about setting boundaries, and this is a really important part of parenting, and again, setting them up, those boundaries up at this age and moving into adolescence. So setting boundaries and limits is really about being your child's brain for them as they develop and grow. So if we look at these ages as being a time when the skills around understanding future consequences of behaviour, being impulsive around behaviour, their behaviour, taking risks is very standard developmental behaviour. So having that ability to have a parent who sets those boundaries and limits in an age-appropriate way is a way of keeping your child safe and valued whilst you let them catch up a little bit in terms of what they are able to do safely. Not about having a sort of dictatorial or being a dictator around what your children do. I'd really encourage you to set those boundaries and have a conversation with them around that, So it becomes a negotiation around what the limits and boundaries are, but don't be afraid to say no and to set things in place that you think are really important. Again, stressing the fact that having that developmental perspective, being firm but fair, is a really good way of doing this. Talk a little bit about flourishing teens. So again, these are the things that you can set up that will help your child grow into a teenager that really flourishes in those years. Having a charismatic adult. And this means someone with whom they identify and from whom they can gather strength. And this might be another significant adult in their lives. It might be a coach or a different family member, a teacher often who is that other adult in their life that they can talk to if they need someone.
Charismatic is an interesting word. I guess that means that that's someone that appeals to the teenager, that they're drawn to that person.
Yep. Yes, that's right. It's someone who they relate to, who they've been able to build a relationship over time, and who can provide that sounding board if they're feeling like they can't bring that back to the parent at that time. So, yep. Islands of competence or a spark. And what we mean here is that the child has something that they're good at. And often this will be in the space of a sport or drama or music, things that they can, when they do go to school, they can have a conversation about, they can feel competent about doing something. And also through this, they can learn the value of persistence. So having to go to training each week, having to practice the musical instrument, and gently persuading them to do that helps them to value that what you get from effort is reward. Emotional intelligence. So, and this can be learned. So what we mean by this is the ability for that child to read social situations and respond appropriately, what we call people smart. So again, parents and other adults can be really great role models around the way that the child can do this. A sense of meaning in their lives, so a feeling of connection. This is really about something in the broader world. So it might be religious, but it doesn't have to be. It's about understanding that that there is something that transcends their material world. There's a bigger world out there. And positive self-talk. So resilient teenagers talk encouragingly to themselves. And again, this can be demonstrated through your own feelings about yourselves and the way you respond to situations, trying to find the positive in what happens. Okay, we're coming to the end. Just lastly, I want to talk a little bit about positive parenting at this age. Society doesn't really respond to teenagers terribly well. We don't really like them as an age group very well. And that's really unfair because having that developmental understanding about what they're going through and keeping in mind that they're the next generation of adults and parents and they need understanding and support to guide them through this period of development. What you'll find towards the end of the teenage year, at the end of the primary school years is suddenly you get that negative talk about how much parents are dreading the teen years, how terrible it's going to be. Virtually always negative talk about those years, but it doesn't have to be like that. Often if you do that, what we know from research is there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you expect risky and rebellious behaviour, you will often get what you ask for. But teenagers are amazing and they're smart, they're driven, they're very politically aware and they're really engaged in the world around them. And I really want to bring that home about the fact that we miss out on being a source of support and guidance when we treat them with this fear and mistrust. We really want to engage with them and help them to understand themselves and the world around them. We can be a great resource for them. And really enjoy this time. You will never, apart from in the infant years, you will never see anything grow so quickly as your teenager in the teen years. So make sure that you engage and really enjoy them growing and learning and becoming the adults that they are, or that they will be. Quick top 3 takeaways. Don't forget to set boundaries, really developmentally important for your child. Choose your battles. Keep your energy for the things that really matter. And lastly, keep those lines of communication happening. Find the spaces and the spots where you can have those conversations with your child. I'll leave you to read this quote. I love this book. Joanne Fedler is a Sydney author. Her book is called Love in the Time of Contempt. It talks about her bringing up her teenagers. So what teenagers need from parents in this socially brutal, gotta be cool, be popular or die world is a fierce kindness, especially when they least deserve it. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Anne.
That's good. Good inspiration. Thanks, Elly. That's great. I love it. I love just it's a very accepting way to talk about teens, and it's good to have an overview because I think sometimes when you're in the middle of it, there is a lot of emotion involved, and a lot of the questions that we had. When you're in the middle of it, there is a lot of emotion involved, and a lot of the questions that we had from the registration questions, we could both tell, I think, from the language that it is challenging at times, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
So I love that positive end.
Yep.
I've got one question from guest 6, and it kind of ties in with a survey question from Jody. You mentioned choose your battles as being great advice.
Yep.
And what happens if you've chosen your battle and you're going to go with it? And the guest 6's question was that her 9-year-old keeps asking for a phone, and the mother says in high school that'll be the phone. That'll be the time that you get the phone. Yep. And Jodie's question was a bit broader. It was, how do I talk to my preteen without escalating into argument?
Yeah.
So you've chosen your battle.
Yep.
You're not backing off. It's a conversation that you've got to have. How do you do it?
Yep. Yeah. So there's a couple of things I can think of. One is about going back to being firm but fair. So you state what your rule is around that, and that's it. The conversation is closed. They might keep coming back at you. What I would do is restate it again. What I've said to you is that I will buy you that phone when you're in high school, or we'll talk about it in a year's time. Often you might want to do that as well. A great strategy is to say, you give me your reasoning as to why you want a phone. I will listen to what you're saying about that, and I'll take it into account. And what they feel then is that they have some control over the situation. Then you can say, thanks very much for that. I really appreciate you explaining that to me. I don't feel comfortable with it right now, but please come back in a year's time, or in whatever amount of time, and talk to me about it again. And what that also does is it breaks the cycle a little bit, because often they'll be bugging you about something that's happening within their peer group at the time, and then they'll move on to something else quite quickly. There's a couple of ideas.
That's good advice, because I wonder whether a lot of parents are getting into that. They're being made to engage in the discussion almost against their will. They're being asked to come up with reason after reason after reason, and that almost sounds like it's sort of short-circuiting. You're being firm and you're listening, but you're not necessarily continuing the engagement. So then I guess you stop an argument developing because you're not going any further.
That's right. What you don't want to get into is that real ongoing cycle of a conversation around this. Again, going back to those rules of communication, be really clear about what you want to say, repeat it, and then that's the end of the conversation for now.
We've just had one come up from Monique, which I don't think we've touched on this. I guess it's about lying. What's the best way to deal with kids when they start to hide things from you? Yeah. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, okay. I guess the situation is going to be different for different people around what that looks like, but same with any sort of behaviour, I think at that age, is to have the open conversation with them about it. If they deny it, again, you're able to draw on whatever evidence you have around it, and try to get to the bottom of why they're hiding it. What's the motivation for them to hide whatever they're hiding? I think one of the other sort of relevant points that came up along the way there was things like, I might turn the Wi-Fi off at night, but they know how to turn it back on again. Well, then that's a case where you have to have some really clear consequences around any of these sorts of behaviours. So you say, if you turn the Wi-Fi on again at night, I will take away your phone for 24 hours. So I want you to understand, if that happens again, then that's the consequence of that behaviour. The hard part for parents often is to stick with that. So don't make a consequence something that is really hard for whatever reason to actually implement, and that you end up miserable because of it as well.
And
so
then I guess then the danger of that is that you back down from the consequence.
Exactly.
So then they know that,
and that's getting into very shaky ground, especially with a teenager.
Well, here's another, I guess, the opposite side, which is from Viviana. This is another registration question. So we've got the battling, fighting teen. Viviana's asking for what do you do if they're lacking motivation? Like, is that a teen or preteen thing when they just won't get up and do stuff?
Yeah. Again, I think the important thing is to, yes, you will get teenage behaviour where they just feel like they don't want to do something. That's quite a developmentally normal thing. Again, I'd encourage the guest to, if it's a pattern of behaviour that's persisting over time, and you're not sure why, you can either go to the GP and have a chat about that. If your child doesn't come, that's okay. You can still have that conversation. You might want to provide some help online, or things like Kids Helpline, or Reach Out, which has really good advice for young people around how to get themselves motivated. But the thing for me would be to really keep an eye on whether that is a pattern of behaviour that might signal something else, or whether it's just something that's situational. Yeah.
Do you you talked about sort of the body changes with puberty. I read on raisingchildren.net.au that often teenagers' sleep pattern changes, so they need more sleep, or their body clock changes, so they're not getting up in the morning. Does that often get confused with a lack of motivation?
Yeah, it might be, and it's a really good point. It does change. The melatonin, which is that sleep hormone that kicks in, it happens later for teenagers. So you will start to get that pattern where a teen wants to go to bed later and they find it really hard to get up in the morning. Terribly difficult when it's the school term, and I know there'll be lots of parents out there who are right at that point in time at the start of the school year where getting your child out of bed is really hard. That is a biological fact. They're not trying to be difficult. Their melatonin kicks in later, and that is biologically the way that their body works. So what we actually have is a situation where school isn't set up in a way that's teenage friendly. So whole nother webinar.
Those poor kids.
Yeah.
Here's another one. Here's one from Jody. I guess it's getting back to boundaries. So Jody's asking, is it okay to ignore slamming of doors, I hate you, if it's not hurting anyone? So I think, again, that's you want to set your limits. Where's the boundary? What's the limit?
The limit is hurting someone. Again, some of that sort of behaviour is typical and quite normal adolescent behaviour. If there's a lot of I hate yous, again, going back to that point that you're kind of the safe person for them to blow their emotions on, but it's perfectly reasonable when everything calms down is to say to that child, when you say that you hate me, that makes me feel sad. Can we talk about that? But definitely do it, again, going back to at a time where you're calm and they're calm. The classic thing that I've heard about door slamming is that one child who engaged in constant door slamming very loudly, the parent took it upon themselves to remove the door, and you get the door back when you stop behaving that way. So so what that does is take away privacy, which a teenager loves. So very extreme but very effective way to stop the behaviour.
Extreme but not really hurtful, like you're not calling them names or belittling them, or
so it's always a consequence for a particular behaviour, and again, follow through that consequence and make it reasonable.
Can we answer another webinar question from Jill? She was asking about dealing with worry, so anxiety. Is that something that we see more of in these years?
It is. It particularly, you'll see it start to happen in the teen years. But very much, again, the different things that are going on for teenagers in these preteen years, such as that, particularly school transition, trying to figure out whether answering that "am I normal" question, can all create anxiety and worries for a child. Again, I'd be saying if that is something that happens in a situational way, that it's contained to worries about a particular thing, but then the child generally is happy, then again, that's a developmentally appropriate response. If it's a pattern of behaviour where the child is anxious, or they start to refuse to go to school or stop doing the things that they want to do, by all means, again, see your GP or seek some help, because the best way of dealing with anxiety is to catch it early.
And I guess anxiety is normal as well, isn't it? Am I normal?
Yeah, look, a small amount of stress is the thing that gets us going. It's a fight or flight response to things that are happening. A small amount of stress in certain situations is good, but when that starts to get out of control, or is not, is not calming in any way, or they can't find a way to calm themselves, The other good thing to note for kids is there's some really great apps and great things that can help them relax and meditate and calm themselves. Reach Out Breathe is one, and Reach Out Worry. The Reach Out people have a lot of really good things that that kids can use. So I'll make sure I add some of those into next week's resource list if people come along. Yep.
Yep. Thanks, Guest 7. I think I've got my microphone in the wrong spot, but I think the most important person to listen to is Elly. What else have we got? We did have one about body image.
Yep.
We're sort of getting close to time, but I do think those with teenage girls might be interested in your thoughts on maybe how do you promote a positive body image without kind of overdoing it, I suppose. You don't want to be talking about their bodies too much.
Yeah, and parents are up against it when we come to the use of social media and the faultless images that young people have access to and the doctored images on the 24/7 world of Instagram. So again, yeah, really good thing to bring up. Having a positive body image home where you try to resist talking about weight and talking about body issues when your child's around, encouraging them to be confident in themselves and their bodies. It is a time when these issues are really very much front of mind as a child's body is changing. So again, be really sensitive to that. Try not to engage in teasing or bringing attention to the changes that's happening for the child.
Yep.
Encourage good role model, good body image yourself, and again, watch out for things that might escalate into something more serious.
Yeah, role modelling good body image is a great
definitely.
one for parents. We've probably reached the end. We have covered, I reckon we've covered an amazing amount of information actually. I've enjoyed it, and thank you, Elly.
Very welcome. Thank you for coming.
A reminder that this is a recorded presentation, so you can go back and have a listen if you had to leave or missed bits. We did have some questions about resources. I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some suggestions from Elly to perhaps hand out to you separately or put in an email, or we can raise that again in the presentation next week. So that's the Preteens and Positive Tech webinar next week. If you haven't already signed up, you will receive a link to that in the email that we send you after this webinar. We would love to hear from you and ways of improving the webinars. So we'll put a link to the survey up on the screen, and we'll also have a link to that at the end of the webinar. So please let us know what you think. Once again, we know that this is can be a great time, can be a fantastic, wonderful time to share with your child, and there will be challenging times. And we're just putting some links up on the screen if anything concerns you anything has concerned you that we've discussed, and you need further help.